The courtroom fell silent the moment Judge Bradford Kane slammed his gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a warning shot. 17-year-old Nia Carter stood alone before him, her shoulders stiff and her hands trembling. Laughter drifted from several spectators seated behind her. The sound cut deeper than any insult. Judge Kane leaned forward with open contempt in his eyes. He stepped down from the bench and invaded her space without hesitation. Then he snatched the documents from her hands and scattered them across the polished floor. Papers fluttered around her feet while the audience watched. "Pick them up," he barked. His polished shoe tapped impatiently as she bent down. Her court-appointed attorney remained silent. He avoided eye contact completely. "Remember your place?" Kane sneered before returning to the bench. Nia tightened her jaw and clutched a small notebook against her chest. Nobody in that courtroom knew the truth. Hidden inside that notebook was information powerful enough to destroy the judge's career. Earlier that morning, sunlight crept across the old courthouse steps. Nia adjusted the sleeves of her simple blue blouse. It was the nicest outfit she owned. Beside her walked her father, Marcus Carter. His maintenance uniform had been pressed carefully before dawn. Missing work would hurt their finances, but they had no choice. They could not afford a private lawyer. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Stand tall," he whispered. "Speak clearly. Look them in the eye." Nia nodded quietly. She held her notebook tighter. Every page contained weeks of observations, recorded carefully and methodically. She had prepared for this day far more than anyone realized. Their assigned attorney finally appeared in the hallway. Attorney Walsh shuffled through a mountain of paperwork before locating her file. "Nia Carter," he muttered. "Right. The hotel trespassing case." His voice carried little interest. "Judge Kane's courtroom today. Listen, just accept the plea agreement. Community service is better than detention." Nia tried to explain herself. She began describing what really happened at the hotel. Walsh interrupted before she could finish. "Kane is tough on people from neighborhoods like yours. Take the deal and move on." His words felt less like advice and more like surrender. Across town, Judge Kane adjusted his expensive tie inside his luxurious home. He glanced at his watch and complained about juvenile cases wasting valuable court time. One file caught his attention immediately: the alleged trespassing case involving Nia Carter. He picked up his phone and called a business associate connected to the hotel. "Don't worry," he said confidently. "I'll make an example out of her. People need to understand they cannot wander into places where they do not belong." The call ended with laughter. Kane smiled to himself before leaving for court. Back inside the courthouse, Nia sat quietly and watched the proceedings. A white teenager accused of shoplifting received a warning and limited community service. Another white defendant facing vandalism charges received a reduced penalty after his father spoke briefly. Then a black teenager appeared before the bench. The atmosphere changed immediately. Kane's voice became colder, his patience vanished. The sentence was harsh and unforgiving. Nia recorded everything in her notebook. Every word, every reaction, every difference. Her notes became more detailed with each case. When the bailiff called her name, Nia approached the defense table carefully. Judge Kane barely looked at her. "Another trespassing case," he sighed dramatically. "Young people seem convinced they can go wherever they want." Attorney Walsh attempted to speak on her behalf. Kane interrupted him instantly. He pointed to an old incident involving a city park. Nia explained that she had studied beneath streetlights because electricity at home had failed again. Kane dismissed her explanation without consideration. Then the prosecutor described her presence near restricted conference rooms inside the Grand Hotel. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Kane asked. "I was there for a program," Nia replied. Kane laughed openly. "A program?" The implication hanging in the room spoke louder than his words. Throughout the hearing, Nia continued writing in her notebook. Her pen moved steadily despite the pressure surrounding her. Kane eventually noticed. "What are you writing?" he demanded. "Just notes, Your Honor," Nia answered. "Hand it over." Reluctantly, she complied. Kane flipped through the pages. At first, he seemed amused. Then his expression changed. He discovered detailed records documenting courtroom behavior, sentencing patterns, quotations, and observations. For a brief moment, genuine concern flashed across his face. Then he slammed the notebook shut and tossed it back toward her. Quite the little researcher, he mocked. Kane suddenly ordered Nia to stand in the center of the courtroom. He forced her to explain why she believed she belonged inside a luxury hotel. Every answer she offered was interrupted. Every explanation was dismissed. He even made her turn around so the courtroom could inspect her clothing. Humiliation spread through the room like smeh, yet Nia refused to break. She stood with quiet dignity while strangers whispered. A woman seated in the back row watched everything closely. She never looked away. Then Kane called the hotel owner on speakerphone. The man claimed no educational program had been scheduled. The courtroom accepted his words immediately. Kane looked satisfied. Nia remained calm despite the growing pressure. A single tear threatened to appear, but she blinked it away. Suddenly, her phone vibrated inside her pocket. She did not reach for it. The screen lit briefly with a message: "Hold steady. Justice is coming. You are not alone." Moments later, Judge Kane announced a 15-minute recess. The gavel struck. Conversations exploded throughout the room. Nia returned to her seat while her father looked at her with pride and concern. She quietly excused herself and headed toward the restroom. She needed a moment to breathe. She needed a moment to recover. What she did not know was that behind the courthouse walls, powerful people were already moving. And before the day ended, the balance of power inside that courtroom would change forever. The courthouse restroom felt colder than the courtroom itself. Nia Carter locked herself inside a stall and finally released the emotions she had buried. Silent tears slid down her cheeks. Her hands trembled as she gripped the metal divider beside her. Every insult from Judge Bradford Kane echoed inside her mind. Every laugh from the spectators returned like a fresh wound. Yet beneath the pain lived something stronger. Determination. She splashed cold water across her face and stared at her reflection. She refused to let him see her broken. The restroom door opened softly. Footsteps approached with confidence and purpose. Nia straightened immediately. A sharply dressed black woman entered, wearing a charcoal business suit that radiated authority. Nia recognized her instantly. She had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, watching, observing, recording everything. The woman offered a calm smile. "Nia Carter?" she asked. Nia nodded cautiously. The woman extended a business card. "My name is Olivia Bennett. I am the Educational Director of the National Scholars Achievement Program." Recognition flashed across Nia's face. Dr. Bennett was the very person she had been scheduled to meet at the Grand Hotel. Confusion flooded her mind. "But the hotel owner said no program existed," Nia replied. Dr. Bennett shook her head. The hotel owner was either misinformed or chose not to verify the facts. "Our organization reserved that conference room weeks ago through the corporate office. Everything was documented. You were invited legally and officially." Nia felt her heartbeat quicken. For the first time that day, someone had confirmed the truth she had been trying desperately to tell. Dr. Bennett leaned closer. "What happened in that courtroom should never have happened. Unfortunately, it is not the first complaint we have heard regarding Judge Kane." Nia glanced down at her notebook. Dr. Bennett followed her gaze. "Your notes caught our attention immediately," she said. "We have received reports from students, parents, and attorneys over the past year. Many described similar treatment, harsh sentences, public humiliation, different standards based on race and background. But reports alone were never enough. We needed evidence. We needed documentation." Nia's notebook suddenly felt heavier in her hands. Weeks of observations no longer seemed like a school project. They looked like proof. At the same moment, inside his private chambers, Judge Kane loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of water. He appeared irritated but confident. His phone rang. A state senator greeted him on the other end. Kane laughed as they discussed upcoming judicial appointments. "There has been some concern about diversity and sentencing patterns," the senator mentioned cautiously. Kane rolled his eyes. "Political nonsense," he replied. "Nobody has ever challenged me successfully. Another teenager trying to play victim is not going to change that." He ended the call, convinced he remained untouchable. Back in the restroom, Dr. Bennett made several urgent phone calls. Her voice became crisp and professional. She first contacted the hotel's corporate headquarters. Within minutes, executives confirmed the scholarship interview had been scheduled exactly as Nia described. Then Bennett contacted the State Judicial Ethics Commission. Nia could only hear fragments of the conversation. "Yes," she said firmly, "we are witnessing the behavior firsthand. Everything is being documented. Every word, every action." Finally, she called a prestigious law firm known for challenging civil rights violations. "We need representation immediately," she said. "Not tomorrow. Today." The restroom door opened again. Marcus Carter entered cautiously after receiving permission from Dr. Bennett. Concern filled his eyes the moment he saw his daughter. Dr. Bennett quickly explained everything. Marcus listened in stunned silence. The scholarship interview had been real. The trespassing allegation lacked merit. Judge Kane's conduct was already under scrutiny. When she finished speaking, Marcus exhaled slowly. The anger in his eyes was impossible to miss. "What happens now?" he asked. Dr. Bennett answered carefully. "Nia must remain calm. No matter what happens inside that courtroom, she cannot lose control. Powerful people are watching. Timing matters." Nia inhaled deeply. She felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. For months, she had gathered information because something felt wrong. Now those observations were becoming evidence in a much larger investigation. Dr. Bennett introduced another woman who had quietly entered the restroom moments earlier. She wore a government identification badge. The words "State Ethics Commission" were clearly visible. The woman tapped her tablet gently. "Every minute of today's proceedings is being preserved," she said. "Nothing will disappear." A few minutes later, they returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere felt different. Several unfamiliar faces now occupied seats in the gallery. Some carried notebooks. Others wore official credentials. Nia noticed them immediately. Judge Kane returned from recess looking irritated. His expression hardened when he saw her sitting calmly at the defense table. He slammed the gavel and began speaking before anyone else could. After consideration, he announced, "I have decided upon an appropriate punishment." His voice carried unmistakable satisfaction. Nia listened quietly as he outlined an unusually severe sentence. The punishment went far beyond community service. Kane ordered a public apology, published in the local newspaper. He demanded 200 hours of labor. Most humiliating of all, he insisted the work be completed at the Grand Hotel itself. "Perhaps cleaning bathrooms will teach respect for private property," he declared. Shock rippled through the courtroom. Even Attorney Walsh looked uncomfortable. He attempted a weak objection. Kane silenced him immediately. Marcus clenched his fists. Nia lowered her eyes, yet deep inside she remained surprisingly calm. Something was changing. Then a voice echoed from the back of the courtroom. "Objection." Every head turned instantly. A tall attorney in an expensive suit stood confidently and began walking toward the front. The room fell silent. Judge Kane's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to visible concern. The stranger introduced himself calmly. "Thomas Reynolds, Marshall and Reed Law Offices. Effective immediately, I will be representing Miss Carter." A wave of surprise swept through the gallery. Nia stared in disbelief. Dr. Bennett smiled slightly. The battle she thought she was fighting alone had suddenly become something much larger. And Judge Kane was no longer the only powerful person in the room. The courtroom remained frozen as Thomas Reynolds approached the defense table. Every step he took seemed to shift the balance of power. Nia Carter watched in stunned silence. Only minutes earlier, she had felt completely alone. Now one of the most respected attorneys in the state stood beside her. Judge Bradford Kane gripped his gavel tightly. His jaw flexed beneath reddening skin. The confidence that had fueled his earlier humiliation tactics seemed noticeably weaker. Reynolds placed official documents before the bench. "My motion to substitute as counsel has already been filed, Your Honor," he stated calmly. "Since no final sentence has been entered into the record, Miss Carter has every legal right to new representation." Kane examined the paperwork carefully. He searched for a procedural excuse to reject it. Finding none, he reluctantly nodded. Attorney Walsh quickly gathered his files and retreated from the courtroom. Relief flooded his face as though he had escaped a storm. Reynolds immediately took control. "Your Honor, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges." Reynolds spoke with absolute confidence. Kane barely allowed him to finish. Motion denied. The response came instantly. Reynolds remained unfazed. Then perhaps the court can explain why Miss Carter's testimony was never properly investigated before today's proceedings. Kane leaned forward. The hotel owner already confirmed there was no legitimate reason for her presence. Reynolds opened a folder and removed several documents. Actually, Your Honor, evidence suggests otherwise. The courtroom grew quieter. Even the spectators seemed afraid to breathe. Reynolds presented official records from the Grand Hotel's corporate office. The documents confirmed that the National Scholars Achievement Program had reserved conference facilities on the exact day in question. Additional records showed Nia's name listed among invited participants. A ripple of surprise spread across the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Kane studied the paperwork longer than expected. His irritation deepened with every passing second. Nia sat quietly while events unfolded around her. Her notebook remained open beside her. She continued recording every detail, every interruption, every reaction, every inconsistency. Across the gallery, Dr. Olivia Bennett watched carefully. Several new observers had entered during recess. Some carried state identification badges. Others appeared to be attorneys. Judge Kane noticed them too. Sweat began forming along his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. The prosecutor finally stood. Your Honor, the state was not previously provided with this information. Reynolds turned toward him. Because nobody investigated her claims. A young woman was accused of trespassing, yet nobody verified whether she had permission to be there. Nobody contacted the scholarship program. Nobody contacted corporate management. They simply assumed guilt. Several spectators exchanged glances. The prosecutor quietly sat back down. Judge Kane attempted to regain control. The court will review these documents later, he announced. However, this last-minute evidence appears designed to confuse the proceedings. Reynolds smiled politely. Respectfully, Your Honor, one phone call would have uncovered these facts before Miss Carter was publicly humiliated. Kane's face darkened immediately. The word humiliated lingered heavily throughout the room. Everyone knew exactly what had happened earlier. Then Reynolds introduced another issue. He requested that sentencing records from previous cases be entered into discussion. Kane objected immediately. Irrelevant, Reynolds disagreed. Over the past several months, defendants facing similar charges have received dramatically different outcomes. Minority defendants consistently received harsher treatment. White defendants frequently received reduced penalties. Kane's hand tightened around the gavel. Are you accusing this court of misconduct? He demanded. Reynolds never raised his voice. I am presenting statistical observations supported by public records. A heavy silence followed. More officials quietly entered through the courtroom doors. Nia noticed a woman wearing a State Bar Association badge. Another observer carried credentials identifying him as an investigator. Kane's eyes tracked every new arrival. The gallery was no longer filled with ordinary spectators. Witnesses had become observers. Observers had become investigators. The courtroom no longer belonged entirely to him. Suddenly, Kane redirected his frustration toward Nia. The defendant should have spoken more clearly regarding her alleged appointment. Before Nia could respond, Reynolds stood. Court transcripts will show she attempted to explain herself repeatedly. She was interrupted multiple times. The statement landed heavily. Several spectators nodded in agreement. Even the court reporter paused briefly before continuing her work. The atmosphere shifted again when Reynolds called his first witness. Dr. Olivia Bennett approached the stand. She carried herself with calm authority. After taking the oath, she explained the purpose of the National Scholars Achievement Program. Nia Carter, she testified, was one of the most promising students identified statewide. Despite financial hardship, she maintained exceptional academic performance while volunteering extensively within her community. Kane attempted to interrupt. Character testimony is irrelevant, Reynolds responded immediately. Her legitimate reason for being at the hotel is directly relevant. Dr. Bennett continued, the Grand Hotel regularly hosted scholarship interviews through a corporate partnership. Students from underserved communities were invited specifically because the organization wanted them exposed to professional environments. We believe talented young people deserve opportunities regardless of background, she explained. The statement resonated throughout the room. Several people quietly applauded before being reminded to remain silent. The prosecutor finally spoke again. In light of this new evidence, the state requests additional time for review. For the first time all day, the prosecution appeared uncertain. Judge Kane ignored the request completely. Instead, his attention locked onto Nia's notebook once more. He pointed directly at it. "Hand over those notes immediately." Reynolds rose before Nia could react. "Objection. Those notes constitute protected work product." Kane slammed his gavel. "I want to know what she is writing about my courtroom." The admission echoed through the chamber. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Kane seemed to realize what he had revealed only after the words left his mouth. His concern was no longer about the alleged trespassing charge. His concern was about himself. Then Nia slowly stood. Her voice remained calm. "Actually, Your Honor, I would be happy to explain exactly what I have been documenting." Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. And for the first time that day, Judge Bradford Kane looked genuinely afraid. The silence inside the courtroom felt almost physical. Every person present stared at Nia Carter. Judge Bradford Kane remained frozen behind the bench. Moments earlier, he had demanded her notebook. Now he faced the possibility of hearing exactly what it contained. Nia stood slowly, her hands steady despite the pressure surrounding her. The fear that had followed her into the courthouse that morning seemed to have disappeared. In its place stood quiet determination. Judge Kane cleared his throat. "Proceed," he said carefully. The confidence that usually filled his voice had weakened. Nia opened the notebook and turned several pages. Her handwriting covered nearly every inch of paper. Dates, names, observations, statistics, months of work. "What began as a school research project became something much larger," she explained. "I wanted to study whether justice was applied equally in our county courts." Several people in the gallery leaned forward. Even the court reporter paused briefly before continuing. Nia described how she attended hearings across multiple courtrooms. She observed defendants from different backgrounds facing similar charges. She recorded sentencing outcomes, attorney interactions, interruptions, and judicial comments. "Initially, I expected the results to be balanced," she said. "Instead, I noticed patterns. Consistent patterns." Her voice remained calm and measured. She was no longer speaking like a frightened teenager. She sounded like a researcher presenting findings. Reynolds watched quietly as Nia continued. Judge Kane shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The gallery remained completely silent. "According to my records," Nia said, "minority defendants received significantly harsher penalties for comparable offenses. White defendants were more likely to receive reduced fines, probation, or diversion programs. Minority defendants received stricter punishments and fewer opportunities for leniency." She turned another page. "In this courtroom specifically, black defendants were interrupted considerably more often than white defendants." A murmur spread through the room. Kane immediately slammed his gavel. "This is absurd. Statistical nonsense from a child." Nia remained composed. "These observations are based on documented hearings, public records, and official transcripts. Every entry includes dates and case references." Several investigators exchanged meaningful glances. One woman in the front row began reviewing documents inside a thick folder. Kane noticed her immediately. Dr. Olivia Bennett rose from her seat. With permission from counsel, she addressed the court. "Nia Carter is one of the most accomplished students our program has ever evaluated. Her research has already attracted academic attention beyond this county. She has been invited to present her findings before educational organizations and civic leaders." Bennett handed a separate folder to Reynolds. Inside were letters of recommendation and independent evaluations supporting Nia's methodology. Judge Kane's frustration intensified. "This hearing concerns trespassing, not academic projects." Reynolds responded immediately. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the defendant's research became relevant the moment you demanded access to her notebook and questioned her credibility. Furthermore, the court's conduct toward Miss Carter directly relates to the concerns documented within those pages." Kane opened his mouth to object, but stopped when another voice interrupted. Director Samantha Williams stood from the gallery. Her official identification badge caught the light as she approached the front. "I believe the court should hear this information." The room immediately recognized the significance of her presence. Williams introduced herself as a representative of the State Judicial Ethics Commission. A visible wave of tension passed across Kane's face. Several spectators exchanged surprised looks. They suddenly understood why so many unfamiliar observers had appeared during the recess. Williams addressed the courtroom calmly. "Over the past year, our office has received multiple complaints regarding patterns of behavior occurring within several county courtrooms. Ms. Carter's independent research attracted our attention because her findings closely matched concerns already under review." Kane stood abruptly. "This is highly inappropriate." Williams remained unfazed. "What would be inappropriate is ignoring credible evidence." The room fell silent once more. Reynolds then presented additional evidence. Security footage from the Grand Hotel appeared on a screen brought into the courtroom. The video clearly showed Nia entering through the front entrance. A hotel employee greeted her. The employee verified her identification and escorted her directly toward the conference area reserved for scholarship interviews. The timestamp matched the date of the alleged trespassing incident. No reasonable interpretation supported the accusation against her. The prosecutor looked visibly uncomfortable. After reviewing the footage, he rose slowly. "Your Honor, based on this evidence, the state has serious concerns regarding the validity of the charge." Kane stared at him in disbelief. The prosecutor continued, "We request dismissal pending further review." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Kane's control over the proceedings weakened further. Nia remained standing. She looked directly at the judge for the first time that day. Months ago, she would have lowered her eyes. Now she met his gaze without hesitation. "I never wanted attention," she said softly. "I never wanted publicity. I simply wanted the truth." Her words carried through every corner of the courtroom. Several spectators nodded quietly. Others appeared emotional. Director Williams stepped forward again. "Judge Kane, our commission has been monitoring this courtroom for several months. Today's proceedings have provided substantial additional documentation. Everything said and done during this hearing has been preserved. Every statement, every ruling, every interaction." Kane's face lost color. For the first time, the possibility of consequences became real. Then another surprise arrived. A court officer entered hurriedly through the side door, carrying an official envelope marked with the state seal. He approached the bench and handed it directly to Judge Kane. The courtroom watched as Kane opened the document. His eyes moved across the page. The color drained completely from his face. His hands began to tremble. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any gavel strike, because whatever was written inside that envelope had just changed everything. Judge Bradford Kane stared at the document in his trembling hands. The courtroom remained silent. Every eye focused on him. Moments earlier, he had controlled every aspect of the proceedings. Now uncertainty spread across his face like a gathering storm. His usual confidence had vanished completely. He read the document again as though hoping the words might somehow change. Director Samantha Williams stepped forward calmly. "Your Honor, would you like the contents read into the record?" Kane immediately folded the paper and lowered it toward the bench. "That will not be necessary." His voice sounded strained. Reynolds rose from the defense table. "Given the extraordinary circumstances, the defense requests full transparency. The public has a right to understand why these proceedings have changed so dramatically." Several observers nodded in agreement. Williams addressed the courtroom directly. "The document concerns an emergency administrative action authorized by the State Judicial Ethics Commission. Based on evidence already gathered and events witnessed today, the Commission has expanded its investigation into allegations of judicial misconduct." A wave of whispers moved through the gallery. Kane slammed his gavel. Order. The word lacked its usual authority. Few people seemed intimidated anymore. Nia sat quietly beside Reynolds. She watched the transformation unfolding before her. Earlier, Kane had treated her like a powerless teenager. Now, powerful officials were openly questioning his conduct. Her notebook remained open. She continued writing carefully. Every development mattered. Every reaction belonged in the record. Across the room, Marcus Carter observed his daughter with growing pride. He had always known she possessed strength. Today, the entire courthouse was beginning to see it. Reynolds requested permission to continue presenting evidence. This court has already heard proof that Miss Carter was legally present at the Grand Hotel. We have also established significant concerns regarding the handling of her case. However, there is another issue requiring immediate attention. He opened a thick folder and removed several charts. These charts summarized sentencing patterns across hundreds of cases. The numbers were difficult to ignore. Director Williams confirmed that investigators had independently reviewed many of the same records. In numerous instances, minority defendants received harsher outcomes than white defendants facing comparable charges. Community service hours differed dramatically. Probation opportunities differed dramatically. Financial penalties differed dramatically. The pattern extended across years. Several spectators exchanged shocked expressions as the information appeared on a projection screen. Judge Kane attempted to interrupt. Statistical analysis cannot capture the complexity of individual cases. Reynolds agreed partially. That is true. Which is why the defense also reviewed transcripts. He displayed excerpts from previous hearings. Multiple statements showed Kane speaking respectfully to some defendants while displaying open hostility toward others. The contrast was unmistakable. Each example increased tension throughout the room. The prosecutor finally rose once again. His discomfort had become impossible to hide. Your Honor, after reviewing the newly presented evidence, the state formally moves to dismiss all charges against Miss Carter. The words echoed through the courtroom. Several spectators gasped. Marcus lowered his head briefly, overwhelmed with relief. Nia closed her eyes for a moment. The accusation that had threatened her future was finally collapsing. Kane's face hardened, motion denied. The response came instantly. The gallery erupted into whispers. Reynolds stood again. Respectfully, Your Honor, the prosecution itself no longer supports the charge. The evidence demonstrates that Miss Carter committed no crime. Continuing these proceedings serves no legitimate legal purpose. Kane gripped the edge of the bench. This court will determine what serves a legitimate purpose. His voice carried anger rather than authority. Director Williams exchanged a glance with several investigators. Then she approached the front row and retrieved another document. This one carried multiple signatures. The atmosphere changed immediately. Even Reynolds seemed surprised. Williams handed the document to the court officer, who delivered it directly to the bench. Kane looked at the page and froze once more. This order authorizes immediate review of all active proceedings under your supervision pending investigation, Williams announced. Effective immediately, any final rulings issued today will be subject to emergency oversight. The gallery erupted again. Kane's authority was shrinking in real time. For the first time during his career, someone else was watching every decision he made. Meanwhile, reporters gathered outside the courthouse. News of the hearing had begun spreading rapidly. Social media posts multiplied by the minute. Television crews arrived from neighboring counties. Legal analysts discussed rumors of a major ethics investigation. What started as a simple juvenile trespassing case was becoming a statewide story. Back inside the courtroom, Nia continued listening quietly. Despite everything happening around her, she remained focused. This had never been about revenge. It had never been about destroying anyone. She wanted accountability. She wanted fairness. Most importantly, she wanted future defendants treated with dignity. Her research had always been about the system, not the spotlight. Then Reynolds delivered another unexpected revelation. He called a new witness. A former court employee stepped forward nervously. After taking the oath, she looked directly toward Judge Kane. The room grew silent. I worked in this courthouse for 7 years, she began, and I was instructed to handle certain cases differently depending on who the defendants were. The words landed like an explosion. Several investigators immediately opened their notebooks. Judge Kane's face turned pale, and everyone in the courtroom realized the investigation had just entered a far more dangerous stage. The former court employee adjusted nervously in the witness chair. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the armrests. Every person in the courtroom seemed to lean forward at once. Judge Bradford Kane stared at her with visible disbelief. He clearly recognized her. The woman swallowed hard before continuing. My name is Alexis Rivera. I worked in this courthouse for 7 years as a scheduling coordinator. Director Samantha Williams nodded toward her encouragingly. Alexis took a deep breath. During my employment, I observed patterns that troubled me. Certain cases received unusual scheduling priority. Some defendants received opportunities that others never saw. At first, I assumed there were legitimate explanations. Eventually, I realized there were not. Her voice grew steadier with each sentence. I was instructed to assign particular prosecutors to certain defendants. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Judge Kane immediately slammed his gavel. This testimony is irrelevant and speculative. Reynolds rose instantly. The witness is describing operational procedures directly connected to the investigation. Kane opened his mouth to object again. Before he could speak, Director Williams intervened. The testimony is entirely relevant. The witness has already provided sworn statements to investigators. Kane fell silent, his expression darkened. Alexis continued, there was an understanding within the courthouse. Defendants from affluent neighborhoods often received favorable scheduling. Cases involving minority defendants were frequently assigned prosecutors, known for seeking harsher penalties. Sometimes notes accompanied case files. Reynolds approached carefully. What kind of notes? Alexis hesitated briefly. Phrases like make an example or maintain deterrence. The words echoed through the room. Several observers immediately began writing. Nia Carter listened carefully. Her heart raced. Everything she had documented suddenly felt connected to something much larger. Her notebook had revealed patterns. Alexis was now describing how those patterns operated behind the scenes. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Across the gallery, Marcus Carter sat motionless. Anger and disbelief battled across his face. For years, families like theirs had suspected unfair treatment. Now someone was finally confirming it publicly. Reynolds presented additional records. Emails recovered during the investigation appeared on the courtroom screen. Some messages referenced case assignments. Others discussed sentencing recommendations. While none explicitly mentioned race, the language raised troubling questions. One message referenced maintaining order in problem communities. Another discussed ensuring proper consequences for certain neighborhoods. The implications were impossible to ignore. Judge Kane's frustration finally boiled over. This entire proceeding is a coordinated attack. His voice echoed through the chamber. 20 years of service are being ignored because a few people dislike difficult decisions. Director Williams remained calm. Nobody is questioning difficult decisions, Your Honor. We are questioning unequal decisions. The distinction struck the courtroom with tremendous force. The prosecutor unexpectedly stood again. This time his expression appeared conflicted. There is something the court should know. Every head turned toward him. He explained that younger prosecutors often understood which outcomes were expected in certain courtrooms. Nobody explicitly ordered misconduct, he said carefully. But there were pressures. Career advancement often depended on pleasing the right people. The revelation stunned the gallery. Reporters outside received updates every few minutes. News alerts spread across the state. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Social media exploded with discussions about judicial accountability. Legal organizations issued statements demanding transparency. What had begun as one teenager defending herself against a false charge was rapidly becoming a national conversation. Inside the courtroom, Director Williams introduced another witness. This time it was a senior investigator from the Ethics Commission. He summarized months of research. Hundreds of cases had been reviewed. Statistical disparities appeared repeatedly. Interviews with former defendants revealed remarkably similar experiences. The investigator paused before delivering his conclusion. We found sufficient evidence to believe these patterns were neither isolated nor accidental. The room fell silent. Judge Kane looked smaller than he had that morning. Gone was the commanding figure who had mocked Nia in front of spectators. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the arrogance. For the first time, he appeared cornered. Then the courtroom doors opened. A court officer entered, carrying another sealed package. Unlike the earlier documents, this package bore markings from the Attorney General's office. The officer delivered it directly to Director Williams. She reviewed the contents briefly. Her expression changed immediately. Reynolds noticed, Nia noticed, even Judge Kane noticed. Williams looked toward the bench, then she addressed the courtroom. New evidence has just been received. The Attorney General's investigators have uncovered private communications connected to this matter. Communications that were never supposed to become public. A chill swept through the courtroom because everyone understood exactly what that meant. The most damaging evidence had not even been revealed yet. The courtroom felt suffocating as Director Samantha Williams held the newly delivered documents. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of paper, the hum of air conditioning, the distant clicking of cameras outside the courthouse. Judge Bradford Kane stared at the envelope with growing anxiety. Whatever was inside had clearly changed the investigation. Nia Carter sat perfectly still. She sensed another turning point approaching. Williams reviewed several pages before looking toward the Judicial Review representatives seated in the front row. Then she addressed the court. The Attorney General's office has completed a preliminary review of electronic communications obtained through legal process. These communications involve discussions related to case handling, sentencing recommendations, and courtroom strategy. A wave of tension swept through the room. Kane immediately stood. "I object to the introduction of any material that has not been properly authenticated." Williams remained calm. "The materials have been verified." Reynolds requested permission to examine the documents. After a brief review, his expression hardened. "These communications are deeply troubling." He turned toward the courtroom. Several messages referenced specific categories of defendants rather than individual circumstances. Multiple discussions appear to focus on maintaining harsher sentencing approaches for residents from certain neighborhoods. The room erupted into whispers. One investigator projected excerpts onto a screen. While names had been temporarily redacted, the language was unmistakable. Certain communities were described as requiring stronger correction, others were described as deserving second chances. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Several observers exchanged shocked looks. The implications reached far beyond a single courtroom. Judge Kane attempted to defend himself. "Context matters. Those statements are being misinterpreted." Reynolds responded immediately. "Then perhaps you would like to explain them." Kane hesitated. For the first time all day, he seemed unable to find the right words. His silence spoke loudly. Director Williams introduced another witness. Assistant District Attorney Mark Phillips approached cautiously. He looked exhausted. Months of internal pressure appeared, written across his face. After taking the oath, he spoke carefully. There was never a written policy. Nobody openly instructed prosecutors to seek unequal outcomes. But everyone understood certain expectations. He paused before continuing. Defendants from particular neighborhoods were often treated as future problems rather than individual people. The statement struck the courtroom like lightning. Nia lowered her eyes briefly. She thought about classmates, neighbors, and families she knew, people who often entered court already carrying assumptions made about them. Her notebook suddenly felt heavier than ever. It no longer contained observations. It contained evidence of real lives affected by a broken system. Mark Phillips continued. Young prosecutors quickly learned which recommendations pleased certain judges. Seeking alternative outcomes for minority defendants was often discouraged. Career advancement depended upon understanding the culture. The culture rewarded severity. Several reporters scribbled furiously. Investigators exchanged looks. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Outside the courthouse, crowds had begun gathering. Community leaders arrived alongside activists, attorneys, clergy members, and local residents. Television crews broadcast live updates. Social media discussions exploded nationwide. People debated fairness, accountability, and equal justice. Many shared personal stories describing experiences that suddenly felt validated. Inside the courtroom, Reynolds called attention back to Nia's original case. "We must remember why we are here. A young woman was falsely accused. Evidence supporting her innocence was ignored. She was publicly humiliated despite having done nothing wrong." He gestured toward Nia. The system failed before anyone even bothered to investigate basic facts. The simplicity of the statement made it even more powerful. Director Williams then revealed another development. The Ethics Commission had expanded its review into hundreds of previous cases. Early findings suggested numerous defendants may have received unfair treatment. Some remained incarcerated. Others carried criminal records that might never have existed under equal standards. The realization sent shockwaves through the gallery. Marcus Carter closed his eyes briefly. He imagined families who never received a second chance, people who lacked resources, people who lacked powerful attorneys, people who never met someone like Dr. Bennett. The thought made his chest tighten. Judge Kane suddenly requested permission to make a statement. Everyone turned toward him. He rose slowly and approached the podium. For a moment, it seemed possible he might express remorse. He began by referencing his years of public service. He described difficult decisions. He described maintaining order. Then something changed. As questions intensified, his composure cracked. "You don't understand what it takes to keep communities safe," he snapped. The room froze. "Justice isn't always comfortable. Neither is reality." His voice grew louder. "Some communities create more problems than others. Some people respond to opportunities. Others only respond to consequences." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The mask had finally fallen. Every camera captured the moment. Every reporter recorded every word. And every person present realized that Judge Bradford Kane had just confirmed the very allegations he had spent months denying. The courtroom remained frozen after Judge Bradford Kane's outburst. No one spoke. No one moved. The words he had just spoken hung heavily in the air. Every camera recorded them. Every reporter captured them. Every investigator heard them clearly. Years of carefully maintained professionalism had shattered within seconds. The prejudice hidden beneath judicial robes now stood exposed before the entire state. Justice Rebecca Monroe, chair of the Judicial Review Panel, leaned forward slowly. Her expression revealed neither anger nor satisfaction, only disappointment. "Judge Kane, are you confirming that different communities should be treated differently under the law?" Kane immediately realized the trap. He attempted to backtrack. "My comments are being misunderstood. Context matters." Justice Monroe did not look convinced. "The law requires equal treatment regardless of background," she replied. "That principle is not open to interpretation." Director Samantha Williams requested that Kane's statement be entered into the official record immediately. Court reporters typed furiously. Investigators reviewed notes. The significance of the moment was undeniable. Months of evidence had pointed toward bias. Kane's own words had now provided confirmation. Across the gallery, spectators exchanged stunned looks. Some appeared angry. Others appeared heartbroken. Many looked relieved that the truth was finally being acknowledged publicly. Nia Carter watched quietly from the defense table. She felt no sense of victory, only sadness. The system she had studied was supposed to protect people. Yet one powerful individual had been allowed to influence countless lives unfairly. She thought about every defendant she had observed, every frightened teenager, every worried parent, every family carrying consequences they may never have deserved. The review panel recessed briefly to evaluate the growing mountain of evidence. During the break, reporters flooded courthouse hallways. Legal analysts appearing on television struggled to keep pace with developments. National organizations issued statements calling for broader judicial reform. Community leaders gathered outside the courthouse steps. Many carried signs supporting fairness, transparency, and accountability. Meanwhile, investigators continued reviewing electronic communications recovered during the inquiry. What they discovered raised even more concerns. Additional emails revealed discussions about targeting certain neighborhoods with harsher prosecution strategies. Others referenced maintaining public confidence among influential donors by appearing tough on crime. While none explicitly instructed unlawful behavior, together they painted a troubling picture. Inside a temporary conference room, Director Williams met privately with Reynolds and several state officials. The evidence had become overwhelming. Statistical disparities, witness testimony, internal communications, public statements. Every category supported the same conclusion. Reynolds summarized it carefully. "The issue is no longer whether misconduct occurred. The issue is determining its full scope." Back in the main courtroom, proceedings resumed. Justice Monroe addressed the packed audience. "The panel has reviewed evidence presented thus far. Preliminary findings indicate substantial cause for concern regarding judicial conduct and equal treatment under the law." A murmur swept through the room. Kane stared downward. The confidence that once defined him had disappeared entirely. Then another witness was called. Charles Whitfield, owner of the Grand Hotel, the same man whose earlier testimony had helped support the trespassing accusation. Whitfield approached the stand looking visibly uncomfortable. After taking the oath, he cleared his throat repeatedly. Reynolds questioned him carefully. "Mr. Whitfield, were you fully informed regarding the scholarship program scheduled at your hotel?" Whitfield lowered his eyes. "No, I was not." The admission echoed through the courtroom. Whitfield explained that corporate management routinely handled educational partnerships without his direct involvement. When Judge Kane contacted him earlier, he responded based on incomplete information. He had assumed there was no such program. That assumption proved incorrect. Furthermore, internal records confirmed Nia's invitation, reservation details, and authorized access. The revelation destroyed one of the final justifications supporting the original accusation. Nia had never trespassed, not for a single moment. The charge should never have existed. The courtroom absorbed the reality slowly. A young woman had been dragged through public humiliation because nobody bothered to verify basic facts. Marcus Carter felt emotion rise inside his chest. He remembered how helpless he felt that morning. He remembered watching his daughter stand alone while powerful adults dismissed her voice. Now the truth stood exposed for everyone to see. Justice Monroe addressed the prosecution directly. Based upon evidence presented today, does the state maintain its position regarding the charges against Miss Carter? The prosecutor rose immediately. No, Your Honor, the state formally withdraws support for all allegations. We believe the charge lacks factual foundation. The statement triggered applause throughout the gallery. Court officers quickly restored order, but the emotional release was impossible to contain entirely. Then Justice Monroe delivered another surprise. After reviewing the circumstances surrounding this case, the panel is authorizing an emergency review of previous rulings connected to Judge Kane. Gasps filled the room. Hundreds of cases could be affected. Dozens of convictions could be questioned. Families across the state could soon receive answers they had sought for years. And as investigators prepared their next report, one discovery emerged that threatened to shake the entire justice system even further. Among the recovered communications was evidence suggesting that Judge Kane had not acted alone. Other officials may have known. Other officials may have participated, and the investigation was only beginning to uncover their names. The revelation struck the courtroom like a shockwave. Judge Bradford Kane might not have acted alone. The possibility transformed an already historic investigation into something far larger. Spectators exchanged uneasy glances. Reporters rushed from the room to deliver breaking updates. Investigators immediately began reviewing additional evidence. What had started as a false accusation against one teenager now threatened to expose a network of misconduct reaching deep into the justice system. Justice Rebecca Monroe called for order. The courtroom gradually quieted, though tension remained thick in the air. Director Samantha Williams stood and addressed the panel. Preliminary analysis suggests certain communications involved individuals beyond Judge Kane's office. We are not prepared to identify them publicly at this time. However, evidence indicates that some officials may have been aware of practices currently under investigation. A murmur swept across the gallery. Judge Kane sat motionless. Earlier, he had attempted to dominate every conversation. Now he appeared isolated. Even former allies avoided looking in his direction. The prosecutor who once supported his courtroom decisions sat several feet away, distancing himself from the growing scandal. Kane seemed to understand that the walls protecting him were collapsing. Nia Carter remained calm despite the chaos surrounding her. She glanced at her notebook. The same notebook that Kane had mocked now sat at the center of a statewide investigation. She remembered the countless afternoons spent reviewing transcripts, attending hearings, and documenting patterns others ignored. At times she wondered whether anyone would believe her findings. Today the answer stood before her. Outside the courthouse, public attention reached extraordinary levels. National news organizations joined local reporters. Community leaders gave interviews discussing accountability and reform. Former defendants began sharing personal stories. Many described experiences remarkably similar to those documented in Nia's research. Legal aid organizations established hotlines for individuals seeking case reviews. Within hours, hundreds of calls arrived. Back inside the courtroom, Director Williams presented an updated report. Investigators had completed emergency reviews of dozens of prior cases. The findings were alarming. Multiple defendants appeared to have received unusually severe penalties compared to similar cases handled elsewhere. Some had already completed sentences. Others remained incarcerated. Several families sat quietly in the gallery, tears filling their eyes as they listened. One woman stood during a break and addressed reporters gathered near the hallway. "My son lost years of his life because nobody listened." Her voice trembled with emotion. "We kept saying something was wrong. Nobody believed us. Today feels like the first time anyone has finally heard us." Her statement quickly spread across television broadcasts and social media platforms. Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office expanded its inquiry. Digital forensic teams examined additional records. Investigators reviewed years of communications. Every new discovery seemed to raise more questions. Some messages suggested coordination between court personnel and external actors. Others revealed discussions focused on maintaining certain public perceptions about crime and punishment. While conclusions had not yet been reached, concern continued growing. Justice Monroe then addressed Nia directly. "Ms. Carter, this panel recognizes that your documentation contributed significantly to matters currently under review." She paused briefly. "Few individuals would have demonstrated your persistence under similar circumstances." The statement caught Nia by surprise. She had never sought recognition, she simply wanted fairness. Yet hearing those words carried enormous meaning. Reynolds smiled quietly beside her. Dr. Olivia Bennett looked equally proud. Marcus Carter lowered his head briefly, overwhelmed by emotion. His daughter had walked into the courthouse that morning as a defendant. Now state officials openly acknowledged her contribution to exposing injustice. The hearing continued into the afternoon. Evidence accumulated steadily. Witnesses described troubling experiences. Analysts explained statistical disparities. Investigators summarized ongoing findings. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. The problem extended beyond one bad decision, beyond one unfair sentence, beyond one courtroom. It reflected systemic weaknesses that had allowed misconduct to flourish unchecked. Then Justice Monroe announced that the panel had reached a preliminary determination. The room immediately fell silent. Judge Kane slowly lifted his head. Nia closed her notebook. Reporters prepared their cameras. Spectators leaned forward. Justice Monroe spoke carefully. "Based upon the evidence presented, this panel finds substantial grounds to conclude that Judge Bradford Kane engaged in conduct inconsistent with the obligations of judicial office." A collective gasp spread through the courtroom. She continued. "The panel unanimously recommends immediate suspension pending final disposition." The words landed with tremendous force. 20 years of authority had unraveled in a matter of days. Yet the greatest surprise was still waiting. As investigators finalized their reports, another discovery emerged. Among thousands of reviewed cases, they identified several individuals whose lives had been profoundly altered by questionable rulings. One of those individuals was scheduled to appear at the final hearing, and the story they carried threatened to reveal the true human cost of everything Judge Kane had done. The final hearing drew a crowd larger than anyone expected. Long before proceedings began, every seat inside the judicial review chamber was occupied. Reporters lined the walls. Community leaders filled the gallery. Families affected by past rulings sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for answers. The atmosphere felt heavy with anticipation. Months of investigation had led to this moment. Judge Bradford Kane entered quietly through a side door. The transformation was striking. Gone was the confident figure who once ruled his courtroom with unchecked authority. His shoulders slumped. His expression looked exhausted. The weight of public scrutiny had replaced the arrogance that once defined him. He took his seat without speaking. Few people acknowledged his arrival. Nia Carter sat beside Thomas Reynolds and Dr. Olivia Bennett. Her father occupied a seat directly behind them. Marcus Carter smiled proudly at his daughter. The notebook rested on her lap once again. Its pages had become part of history. What began as a school research project had grown into a force for accountability and reform. Nia never imagined that simple observations could create such change. Justice Rebecca Monroe opened the hearing. She reviewed months of findings, statistical disparities, witness testimony, internal communications, improper conduct, abuse of authority. Each category reinforced the same conclusion. The evidence demonstrated a pattern that could not be explained away by coincidence or misunderstanding. The integrity of the judicial system required accountability. The room remained silent as every detail was placed into the official record. Then came the witness everyone had been waiting for. A man named Marcus Turner approached the stand. Several years earlier, Turner had appeared before Judge Kane, facing charges similar to those brought against white defendants who routinely received probation. Turner received years of incarceration instead. His life changed completely. Employment opportunities disappeared. Family relationships suffered. Educational plans collapsed. He described the experience calmly, though emotion occasionally surfaced in his voice. "I spent years believing nobody cared what happened," Turner said. "Every appeal failed. Every complaint disappeared. People told me to move on. They told me the system was working exactly as intended." He looked toward Nia. Then a young woman started paying attention. She started documenting what others ignored. Because of that, people finally listened. Several spectators wiped tears from their eyes. Turner's testimony was followed by others. Parents described watching their children receive unusually harsh treatment. Former defendants recounted experiences nearly identical to those documented in Nia's notebook. Attorneys discussed patterns they had observed but struggled to prove. One by one, stories transformed statistics into human reality. Numbers became faces. Data became lives. Justice Monroe eventually called for closing statements. Reynolds stood and addressed the panel. This case was never only about one defendant. It was about whether equal justice truly means equal justice. Systems fail when accountability disappears. They recover when ordinary people refuse to remain silent. He gestured toward Nia. Miss Carter did not possess political power. She did not possess wealth. She possessed persistence, integrity, and courage. Sometimes that is enough. Director Samantha Williams then summarized the investigation's broader impact. Hundreds of cases had been reviewed. Dozens were already being reconsidered. New oversight procedures had been implemented statewide. Judicial training requirements expanded. Public transparency increased. Independent review mechanisms strengthened. Reform was no longer theoretical. It was happening. Finally, Justice Monroe delivered the panel's final ruling. The chamber became completely silent. Judge Bradford Kane lowered his eyes. Nia held her breath. Families leaned forward. Reporters prepared their cameras. After careful review of all evidence, this panel unanimously concludes that Judge Bradford Kane violated the ethical obligations of judicial office through demonstrated bias, abuse of authority, and conduct that undermined public confidence in the administration of justice. The words echoed throughout the room. Justice Monroe continued. The panel orders permanent removal from judicial service and referral for additional disciplinary proceedings. A wave of emotion swept across the gallery. Some people cried. Others embraced quietly. Many simply sat in stunned silence. The decision marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Months later, change could be seen throughout the state. Courtrooms adopted new oversight measures. Sentencing data became publicly available. Independent review boards monitored outcomes. Community outreach programs expanded. Families previously ignored finally found avenues to be heard. The system remained imperfect, but it was moving forward. Nia graduated near the top of her class. Universities across the country offered scholarships. She chose to study law and public policy. Her goal was simple. She wanted to help build systems worthy of public trust. The original notebook was eventually preserved as part of a historical archive dedicated to civil rights and justice reform. On a bright afternoon, Nia stood inside a renovated courthouse speaking to students. Sunlight streamed through large windows. The room felt welcoming rather than intimidating. She held up a new notebook identical to the old one. "People often ask what changed everything," she said. "It was not power. It was not money. It was not influence. It was paying attention. It was documenting the truth. It was refusing to stay silent when something felt wrong." The students listened carefully. Nia smiled. Justice is not automatic, she told them. It depends on people willing to protect it. Every generation inherits that responsibility. The audience rose in applause. Marcus Carter watched proudly from the back of the room. Dr. Bennett smiled beside him, and for the first time since entering that courthouse as a frightened teenager, Nia felt certain that her voice had made a difference. The journey began with humiliation. It ended with accountability. But its greatest legacy was hope. Hope that truth still matters. Hope that courage can create change. Hope that one determined person can inspire an entire community to demand something better. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, your viewing location, and share this video.